Hi there, I'm Julia Clouter from SucceedWithDyslexia, and today I'm talking to Kat. Hi, Kat.
Hi, Julia.
Yeah. So Kat Goodacre is a literacy and dyslexia specialist at Crisis UK. Is that based in London, Kat?
Yes, that's right. We have branches across the UK, but I'm personally based in our London office. Yeah.
In London. So is that right in the centre of London, right in the middle of things?
Yeah, it's sort of like East London, Spitalfields area. So Commercial Street.
So at Spitalfields, this is sort of historically an area that's known for deprivation, isn't it? A really tricky area.
It is, yeah, absolutely. It's it's a really interesting kind of historical area in terms of the sort of, I suppose, like the stark contrast between sort of the history of like poverty and obviously and sort of, and even now still people that a number of my students kind of grew up in that area, and then you've got like the city that's there, and you've got obviously where all the artists, and it's an interesting place to work, and it's especially when you're kind of working with people who grew up in the area, and yet you're also surrounded by massive privilege. It's it's an interesting.
Yeah. Okay. There's a dichotomy of everything going on there in that part of London: extreme wealth, extreme poverty, extreme academic advantage, extreme academic disadvantage.
Absolutely.
So the people that you work with in this group that have experienced that extreme academic disadvantage, am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, so I teach literacy to adults who are experiencing homelessness. So the people that tend to come to me are people who have declare that they have literacy difficulties, but that might be, perhaps they went to school but they struggled with learning at school, or perhaps they didn't go to school at all. But they're sort of, I suppose, their common the common factor is that they've reached a point where they want to do something about that, I suppose, and that within the sort of environment of Crisis, we learners work with coaches, and then they're now currently sort of referred to the learning provision if it's something which they're wanting to work on. So for myself, I do as a literacy and dyslexia specialist, I would do dyslexia screenings with people. And then also do kind of learning interventions and really work with them around what their motivations and their goals are. So it might be that that's trying to get a qualification. It might be that they want to improve their confidence with their literacy. Perhaps they had, overwhelmingly people have had negative early learning experiences when they were at school, and so there can be a lot of sort of emotional, I suppose, learning trauma that people kind of bring to our sort of learning environment. In the past, I taught a combination of kind of classes and one-to-one, and was teaching sort of pre-entry up to level 2 functional skills. So it's a real mix, and it's delivered in quite a holistic way, by engaging people's interests. And I've done things like, we were talking about being in East London before. I've done things like develop a sort of creative literacy in East London like curriculum, where I was doing sort of bits of literacy around street art, or around kind of Jack the Ripper, developing like exam papers, but based on historical, like on Jack the Ripper, like and sort of like local history things, and that's been quite successful. So I'm really lucky that I get to kind of be quite creative in the way that I work with people, and actually kind of think about what their sort of motivations are really.
So when you're working with, and you described the learners that you work with as being vulnerable adults in the community, and they would have presumably already had some quite really challenging experiences of getting to grips with literacy and learning how to read, or perhaps at school their story has been one where they've experienced that trauma. Tell me a little bit more about that, and then how that's led to the creative element of what you've been doing.
Yeah. Okay. So, so I suppose firstly I would talk a bit about like the vulnerability aspect, because I think that I'm quite conscious, you know, and particularly I think over the last few years, I'm thinking about like the language that we use around homelessness and around kind of disadvantage, I guess. So I think rather than kind of, I suppose, like vulnerable adults, it's, you know, it's thinking about people whose experiences have made them more vulnerable than perhaps other people. So So I suppose if you've had a number of overwhelmingly, my learners have multiple experiences of trauma in their life. So things that have happened to them, perhaps from birth and from, you know, their sort of home environment, have had, which have then kind of impacted on all of their lives. So within sort of adult learning in general, the general context of adult learning, there's lots of reasons why people might have struggled to engage with learning, so such as dyslexia, you know, and there's going to be a variety of experiences that people have had and barriers that they've faced around diagnosis, around sort of support from teachers, whether they've had support at home and whether they've had support at school, and all of these kind of multiple layers of how that can affect the way that we see ourselves as learners from a young age. And I think that frequently what I see with learners that come to my classes is that they've had trauma in their life in general, and then they have also had trauma around their learning, and this kind of accumulates to a point where when they come to my class, they are afraid, and completely understandably. And so part of my role, I see my role within this environment is to, firstly, to, you know, really to try and empathise with that, and to recognise that it's been a massive journey for that person in order, and, you know, and the achievement that it is for them to come there in the first place. And that's really important, because, you know, so many times when you might have gone to, you know, tried to go to college or before, you know, as an adult, and had a negative experience. So, you know, I've worked with learners who said, like, this is my last, you know, I heard that you were doing, you know, that you were running classes, or that I could work with you. And I've had some really bad experiences in the past, but it is something that I really want to do. And it is, you know, I do struggle with my literacy, and it does impact my life every single day, and, you know, how I feel about myself. And I want to do something, but I feel really helpless. And so I think, so there's part of it, a massive part is about empathizing with their kind of previous experience, and then really helping them to think about what, you know, getting to know them as a person. You know, who are you? What matters to you? What are the things that you are good at? You know, what are your interests? What are your strengths? And, you know, when people have had, you know, multiple negative experiences, it's really hard to see that in yourself. And I you know, I feel that, I see it a lot, but I really, you know, as humans, we're incredibly complex, and it's never just a, you know, a black and white situation where no matter how we see ourselves or we're feeling at a particular time, there's always going to be something, like, you know, there's some positives, and I suppose what I see, part of my role is helping to find people to find their strengths and find their joy, and then help tap into that, which will then hopefully kind of translate into other areas of into how they see themselves as learners. And yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a rambling sort of thing.
Really, actually, very, very insightful. And I was thinking lots of things as you were talking. One of the things I was thinking about was when you mentioned the creativity involved in the work that you do, and you were talking about presenting ideas, journeys that were local, about local history. And I was thinking, what Kat's doing is she's creating a hook. She's looking for the sorts of things that will be of interest interest to her community, the people who come to see her, and trying to find ways to make that learning opportunity sticky for them and enjoyable. And I think that is the key thing when you're working with vulnerable adults, is that you have to do exactly what you do, which is establish that hook, establish the relationship, the listening relationship, and then look for the journey that is going to interest them and intrigue them and want them to continue. That's the sticky bit, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To keep them going. I was also thinking about the chap who said that this is the last time I'm going to do this, and that it's heartbreaking that when people have so many negative experiences, they know that it's something that, so achieving a level of literacy that will enable them to be functionally successful in their lives, doing the basic things like fill out an application form or read the information that's come through from the doctor about when your appointment is, or all those basic things are so crucial. If you don't have access to that level of literacy, then you are either dependent on somebody else to do that for you, or you're socially excluded.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, so one of the biggest things that I've seen is that there's, so firstly, how I work now is quite different to how I used to work. And we used to do, we would have enrollments. And so I would kind of get an opportunity to meet, I'd meet people, would come to enrollment, and we'd have a kind of discussion about, what maybe a little bit about what their learning learning experiences were, or what they'd, around their sort of motivation, I suppose. And but one of the things that I've seen is that there's something when people join a class, and I think you get a sense of people's kind of individual personalities when you do have these discussions. And I really try to kind of, when I form groups, as much as I work on I generally work on a sort of levels base, doing my classes, but I have a little bit of flexibility around that based on personality, because what I've found is, so not my ideal, but like a standard group might be around sort of 6 learners, and could be quite a variety of different backgrounds, but there's a really common sort of themes that bring them together. And those themes are so often around these kind of how they feel about, how they have felt about their early learning, or, what they, experiences of dyslexia. So dyslexia is incredibly prevalent amongst learners, other than, sometimes because they've had they've been fortunate enough to have a diagnosis in school, or more often than not they haven't, and then it's I would do a screening and they were like, I've struggled for my whole life, but I didn't know, and now I know there's it's not that there's something wrong with me, it's just that it's to do my learn, and there's a whole, might talk about that a little bit later on, in terms of sort of having an informed diagnosis, and what people, or at least a kind of a sort of screening which can help people to understand about what dyslexia is. But there's something around working. I've been in groups of people who, perhaps there's been a couple of people who have formerly been in prison, or have been in care, or have who have dyslexia, mixed with. So that learner I was actually talking about was a woman who so she was from. So she had, I forget where she was actually from, but she wore like a burqa, and she had, when she tried to go to college, to sort of adult education college, and had been bullied, felt very kind of bullied within that environment. And it was really amazing that when the day that she said to me, I was never going to, I just thought I would never be able to go back to a class, but here I just feel so accepted, and so I feel like I can be myself. And for that to be the case when she was in a room with mostly other men. I think in that particular group there were about 4 men and 2 women, and the fact that the diversity of their experiences and yet the common things that brought them together was really special. And there was this thing about creating a space where people can feel that they can just let some stuff go, and that there's no shame in where whatever their previous experiences have been, that in this room we're about trying to find what we're excited about, like what are all the things that, whatever's happened in the past, what is it that's that we're interested in. And part of that, so for me, is about exposing them to some of those things and saying, look, so, we thought about this, about current issues, or about, say about kind of history, or, so having conversations, what are you interested in? What do you want to learn about? And then we kind of come to some collective agreement. And then this can be so empowering, because so many times people haven't had choices over their learning, over what they want to look at. And so that's really important, finding out what is their motivation, what are their interests, and then really using that to kind of help kind of develop a sort of pathway forward for them. So for some people that might be exams, for some people that might be that they want to improve their independence because they haven't been they've been struggling with reading and they don't know how to use assistive technology, or know anything about assistive technology to kind of help them to that might be able to help them navigate their way around they get lost all the time, and there are things that can help them with that. So it's incredibly sort of diverse in terms of what we do. But yeah, sorry, again, a little rambling.
This all takes time. A successful methodology, which is what you've just described, to engage an adult learner takes time.
Yes.
And is a commitment to understanding that person, what that person is bringing with them. It's not a question of sitting somebody at a desk or in front of a keyboard and doing a learning or a teaching activity. And I'm interested in how we support vulnerable adult learners who might go to the job centre and then go on to a literacy course, and the differences between what they would experience from that to what you have been doing, which is a much more holistic methodology that looks at that whole person and their experience. So do you think that the chalk and talk and sit down and do the course is a successful model that's running for our vulnerable adult learners, or not?
Well, no, I think okay. So I think there are quite a few things I could say about this. So firstly, I think so. Take, for example, somebody who's just left prison, just as an example. Their experiences, whether they've had any sort of learning, there's some amazing work that happens around literacy in prisons, and so whatever their kind of context is, I suppose, if they're coming out into the big wide world again and they are wanting to engage with some sort of literacy provision, if they've had any experience of that kind of support before, they'll be looking for that again, in a way, I suppose. So there's this thing around like the first point of contact for people when they seek literacy provision. So if you ring a college, and that college, I was talking to a learner the other day who's been working with me, and then he's trying to look for somewhere else to do. He wants to do GCSE English. So, and he was saying, I contacted this. There was like this adult learning service, and he said, I had this conversation with this woman, and she was like, oh, so we might be doing some I can put your name down, but I'm not quite sure, and and he was just like, there was this really, and I explained about the fact that I have dyslexia, and she was like, oh, okay, and there was like a real vagueness around the way that she kind of communicated with him, and he was just like, I just got this like feeling that just wasn't going to be right for me. I didn't, and then he said, he said, so actually I went online and looked at this other college, and this other college that he contacted was one that he had already had some previous contact with when he had to do a dyslexia screen, like a dyslexia exams access arrangement assessment for another college that he'd been to before, and he'd had met this woman there, and she had done the assessments, and she'd had a conversation with him about she'd been like, how have you been managing to cope, like with you're definitely, we knew he was dyslexic because he had been diagnosed when he was a child, and then I had done work with him as well, but he had to have these extra assessments done, and she said, she was saying, like, I'm genuinely interested, what's your experience been, what's your tell me about a little bit about you, and this experience. She was like, and I'm dyslexic as well, so I know, I know how difficult it is, and you've done so well, and these sorts of things. These kind of, like, she was incredibly empathetic, and she was also informative in the way that she supported him. And this for him, at the back of his mind, meant that he'd already had this association at this college. So then for him to pursue that, and he was like, I just filled in this form online. He's like, and I'm going to go and have an assessment there. He's like, I just feel like it's going to be a better place for me to do that. And it's these things which are harder to do. I think you tend to find it more within the sort of the special needs provision, I suppose, within colleges. But when you're just kind of calling up to inquire about something, if you just come up against something, a barrier straight away, where somebody doesn't take an interest, it doesn't have that curiosity, doesn't have that, okay, so having a little bit of a conversation about what is it that you want, what you're looking for, okay, so this is what we can do, and laying out those steps, it's going to be really hard to engage that person. So there's, in a really long rambly way, this to do with the importance of a first point of contact for somebody.
I think it's really helpful to say really clearly, if you were the first point of contact for a vulnerable adult who was coming to you to try and access a course, what would be the key pieces of advice that you would give to that person in that position, so that they could have that good starting point that would be encouraging, and that learner would then feel, or that adult would then feel welcome? Okay. What would they need to do?
Okay, so firstly, I would want to try and put somebody at ease. Okay, so if somebody comes and says, I want to do some literacy learning, and they often say, I can't read at all. We hear this sort of, I can't read at all, even if actually they can read a bit, but this tends to come, I can't read and I can't write. And then you kind of, sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's a mental thing based on their previous experiences. So it's firstly having a conversation with them about their early learning and what's motivating them, and reassuring them that there's nothing wrong with them if they've struggled with learning before, and that I see part of my role as helping them to say, identifying what the areas of difficulty that they have are, but also identifying their strengths, because everybody does have strengths, and you may not feel this at the moment, but you will have strengths, and we're going to find those, and we're going to use these together to help you to kind of to move forward in a way that you want to move forward. So I think so it's partly to do with that. I think then, obviously, myself being a dyslexia assessor and screener, I do think that it's really important to have good initial assessment as well. So having getting an idea of what somebody's literacy levels are, so that then that can obviously help you to plan the provision that you're going, to pitch where your teaching is going to be apart from anything else. Ideally, I think dyslexia screenings can be useful particularly if they think that, I've struggled with these things, and if you have a conversation and they say, it's the speed, it's like I really, and sometimes I get my letters mixed up. There's certain things that people say that give you an idea that you think, okay, so, and you can obviously have a conversation about whether they've had any of those assessments before, but, it can be, having that facility is quite amazing. It's not something that we have at all the different services. I'm now the only dyslexia assessor that we have in crisis. So I think it's a valuable tool to help people understand a bit more about their learning and their the way that they learn. I think so. I think then, as I said, it's about establishing motivation. So what is it that matters to you? Is it, so they might say, I really need to improve my literacy because I need to get my level 2 because I want to go to college and I want to study engineering, for an example. And so then you've got an idea, okay, so this is this person's motivation. So it's looking at where they are now, and then how what are the steps that we need to take. And or it might just be that somebody says, I just need to, this impacts me every day, and I've been putting it off, but I need to do something. And I want to be able to, I've got grandchildren and I want to be able to read them a story. That's really what my motivation is. I want to write a letter. I want to write a letter to my family back home, or, whatever it is, and then working with that and sort of building it step by step and it's to say it's this holistic conversation. It's that's really person-centered and built from what motivates them, because really that's the only way they're going to keep coming back. Because if it's a thing where you're like, so we're running this course and you have to achieve this by a certain time and it has to be done in this way, then that can be really scary for people. And particularly if you've never done that sort of thing before, or if your memories of that in the past are really traumatic, then it's about having that flexibility of approach, which I recognise is quite a privileged position to be in, but it's so important. It has to be paced at a time that works for them. And it might be that people disengage for a while and then they come back, and this is something you have to be prepared for as well. It's not going to be a linear process. It's going to be very up and down, and then it's going to be a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that's your ideal that you want to take. The 2 steps forward, 1 step back is better than the 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. So does that answer a little bit of your question?
It does. I'm thinking about you mentioned an ex-offender coming into a situation where perhaps they'd had some support from maybe someone like Shannon Trust, where they developed a relationship with somebody and had gone on a journey with them, and how crucial that was. And then the expectation is that you will have a replication of that, because that is such a good model for how to teach someone to read, isn't it? The fabulous model. If you don't know about the Shannon Trust, in the Shannon Trust, they're a charitable organisation, and incarcerated individuals who can read teach incarcerated individuals who can't read to read. That's the model. And because they have shared time and shared experiences, there's lots of opportunity to develop a strong relationship and build that confidence model that's so important that you've described, Kat. I was then thinking about what happens when you take this individual who's perhaps an ex-offender, who's then gone through and is looking for support from maybe the job centre, and is told that they have to pass a functional skills literacy. Maybe they had some opportunity with Shannon Trust, maybe they didn't. They're not going to have that personalised approach to support provided to them. And so our roadmap for how we support our most vulnerable individuals isn't really in place in our society until you get to a point where you are in or experiencing such a level of crisis that you've now reached homelessness and become a vulnerable person with perhaps multiple and complex difficulties. And so what are those multiple and complex difficulties that happen if you can't get the right sort of support?
Yeah, so I guess, so, I know we've talked about this before, but ideally, in my I have a dream speech, ideally what you want is some sort of service which has an understanding of the way that trauma affects people's learning. So we know that people, so when we talk about the term multiple disadvantages, I suppose we're looking at things like, people who've experienced different mental health conditions that have impacted their learning, people who've experienced being in prison, people who've experienced homelessness. So this, I suppose, this is the sort of umbrella of multiple disadvantages. The common, themes around that are these kind of what we call compound trauma, this multiple experiences of trauma that people have experienced, which impacts the way that they see the world around them. So ideally, from a learning perspective for adults, you would want to have a service who understands this, who from the outset understands that how difficult it is to walk through the doors of any sort of learning environment, and creates a safe space for those people to be in. So at the moment, I guess the problem that we have is that the provision is often linked to outcomes, in terms of those outcomes being around gaining a qualification. So it might be that even within kind of community learning environments, that you can only access this course, which is in level 2 in literacy, if you are also actively looking for a job, for example. So it's these conditions that are tied to learning, and are becoming even more the case now. They've stopped running certain entry-level qualifications because they're not deemed to be valuable enough for people, and without really recognizing for people's well-being, how important those and the progressive steps that people need to take, and it's insulting to think that somebody might not want that having a certificate in entry 2 is going to be that it's not meaningful, because what if it's meaningful to that person and it's maybe the first exam that they've ever been able to do? So to just have this thing of being so unless it's level 1 is an absolute minimum, and then level 2 is what we're really aiming for, is just, it's so unbelievably lacking in understanding about how people learn and the cumulative way in which we build our confidence around our learning. So I think that there's something around the fact of, when, as you said, when you come out of an environment, so maybe perhaps you've done some things around the way that the Shannon Trusts work, ideally you want to move on to something which has a similar sort of ethos, that has this kind of an understanding of the way that people learn, and thinking about people in a more holistic way. And currently, as we said, it's we've got mainstream adult education provision, which is, although there can sometimes be some flexibility around provision, and whether it's in the day or whether it's in the evening, but it's still very rigid, it's very structured, it's very outcome driven, in terms of, because that's how their funding is that's how they get their funding, right? That's how they only get the funding for that provision if they're getting those qualification outcomes, which will impact the way that teachers are able, and this isn't, as I say, I really recognise there's some amazing teachers that are working in sort of adult education and mainstream environments, but the constant source of frustration that you want to, perhaps as a teacher, you want to be able to, make your learning really holistic, make it very person-centred, but then you're also having to kind of meet these tick box targets is really hard. And as a learner, it just creates more fear, because they're like, well, it's like being back at school. And this is what's, I suppose, there's something in creating an environment which doesn't feel like a person is back at school, because being back at school can just bring back, can basically make people flooded. Absolutely. So when we talk about, so within homelessness services, we work within something called psychologically informed environments, which are it's basically kind of acknowledging the fact, it's prioritising a person's emotional and mental well-being, putting that at the forefront of any provision. And I think, which is very much aligned to trauma-informed support and ways of working. And I just think that, it's not rocket science. As humans, we really, we crave connection. We want to feel understood. And so often when, imagine that you've been in prison, and there are always going to be reasons why somebody ends up in prison, like there are reasons around their own experiences, things that have happened to them will have ultimately kind of, played into the crime that they've committed. But I think there's helping somebody to reframe how they see themselves as a learner, which impacts on how they see themselves as a person, and their ability to kind of reflect on the past, but also recognize where they are now, how far they've come on a journey, and then kind of thinking about, okay, so what are the choices I'm going to make moving forward? What matters to me now? What can I do now? What's in my power? Like these things, these choices are just so important. And as I say, somebody, when they come out of prison, if you have, a mental health condition, for example, that creates barriers in itself around, and I'm not saying, I'm somebody who has a mental health condition, so I know, like I'm not saying, it means that you can't work, but it means that it's not going to be a straightforward linear journey, or that you're not going to, if somebody says, well, you need to do this, that means that you can do it. It's not going to be like you're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days, and you're going to, and you need that support. You need that empathy. You need that understanding that it's like, it's okay, like if you fall over, I've got you, like that is so important. We need, everybody ideally needs this, but it's even more important when people have had multiple experiences of, traumatic experiences, which, that they expect to be let down. They expect, and what we want to do is to create I suppose like a joined up provision, ideally a joined up provision between, say in my kind of my learning vision, it would have an environment where there would be specialist teachers, and there would be opportunities for, linking in with wider services around sort of psychological support, and within, linking with prisons in terms of prison leavers for, there would be arts-based work, there would be, peer mentoring, there would be, and it would be operated in this kind of trauma-informed way that was about, and I just think I fundamentally believe that if we could fund something like that, the benefits to society as a whole are infinite. Like somebody is going to be much less likely to lose their accommodation once they've been housed if they can read their letters that they're getting, and they can, they know how to use assistive technology to the best, to support them with that, or they, if their mental health is improved and they're independent, then so often people want to help other people. So that means that maybe you say like volunteering or peer support within the community, supporting, making a difference. People want to make a difference. And so often when people have had positive experiences, they want to give those positive experiences back. And this is, these are all amazing things beyond getting somebody into a job.
Yeah. The model that you just presented was incredibly clear, and I was picturing it as a star shape with little nodes around the outside, and I was thinking, right, yes, you need to have the services here for mental health and well-being support, and you need to have medical services presumably as well to support people, and you need counselling services and educational services and services that enable people to access through perhaps assistive technology and learn how to use tools that can support them to achieve what they need to achieve. And then also that support for them to understand that reading or whatever their need might be is going to help them within their families, within their immediate community. So I was thinking about storybook dads as well as you were talking. And storybook dads, if you don't know about this, happens again in prisons, and it's a way for a parent to be able to learn to read to their child, and often that's a very motivating factor. Getting a job at the other end might not be a motivating factor, but being able to sit down with your child and read a book together might be an incredibly motivating factor. And actually the impact of that within your family is that you are modeling that reading and literacy and learning and sharing and time together and talking about something is important. And for society, this is incredibly important. For our communities, incredibly important. And so I was making a little star shape in my head thinking, this is the provision that we need to create to support people who are our most vulnerable communities. And I felt that you put that really well, Kat. And your research backs this up, doesn't it, that you've been doing? Tell us a little bit about how your research led you to this sort of model of thinking.
So I think one of the important things is that, I know that from my own networking with different different provision and services and people that are within prison services, within anything to do with sort of homelessness and adult literacy and adult learning, is that there's some absolutely fantastic work that happens, and there are some fantastic services, but that we are all currently quite siloed, particularly within sort of within adult literacy. So one of I know, say, brilliant practitioners working in different environments, but we all talk about how, to connect with each other, we've had to take those kind of, we've had to actively look for each other. We've had to go and find each other. There's no natural way of us coming together. And I think there's something in that as well around kind of creating a kind of a body, a sort of way of bringing people, practitioners, literacy practitioners together to form, and partly through Literacy 100 does that a little bit, as a charitable trust supporting people that are working with people with poor literacy and experience of homelessness. But I think there's a wider need around the work that's done within prisons, the work that's done within kind of mental health services as well. So I just wanted to kind of leave on that. So in terms of my own research, so my MA research that I did, that I've conducted sort of during the time that I've worked at Crisis, was exploring the what motivates adult literacy learners with experience of homelessness to engage in literacy learning, and the factors that they deemed most effective in supporting them to learn. And there were, a number of sort of themes that came out of this. So there was 5 main themes. We've got challenging early experiences, barriers to improving literacy, perceived impact of poor literacy, current motivation to improve literacy, and then approaches that support literacy in adulthood. And this kind of the last, so I suppose there's a couple that would quite like to pull out of that. So there's so the barriers, we've got things like dyslexia. So just I interviewed 10 adult literacy learners, and I didn't actually ask them any questions about dyslexia. That wasn't something that was in the interview, but I think it was like it's like, God, I've got to try and remember. I think it was 70% of the learners that I interviewed declared a diagnosis or of dyslexia. So and they talked about how. So one of the things that was quite interesting is there'd been varied experiences in terms of how they perceived their diagnosis. So some had received it when they were at school, and I spoke to one person who had really positive experiences of diagnosis when they were at primary school, and teachers had kind of picked it up, and then they'd taken his dad in as well, and had explained that this is a learning difference, there's nothing wrong with you, and this was then supported by his dad, and his dad was like, you're special, like there's this is not you're there'll be different way, you will have different skills, and kind of helped him to kind of think about his strengths, which was so important for him. He then, very unfortunately, his father passed away, and he then went to a secondary school where the teachers were not at all supportive and basically told him he was stupid. And he had this massive contrast between his early child experience and then what happened afterwards. And then like some really horrific stuff happened later on. But so people have how people receive their diagnosis, and then other people might not get a diagnosis till they're in college. And again, like, if it's not explained to you, if it's just like, oh, so you've got dyslexia, and it's just a bit, it means that you can't, you've got difficulty with reading and writing, unless it is explained in the context of the what that means for your learning in terms of the things you might find difficult, but it also in terms of the things that you might have strengths. And this is not to say, there's a stereotype idea that people are really creative if they you can be good at art. That's not necessarily the case, but we do know that people can be very good, have real strengths. Lots of architects who are dyslexic, lots of people that are quite creative, people that think, very strong verbal communicators. There's that's so important. Having, when you're going to be if you're going to be labelled with something, basically you need to make sure that label is not that it's a useful thing, that it's not something which is just given and then, well, that's it. So, and this person just thinks there's something wrong with me. So dyslexia was one of the barriers. Mental health conditions was another barrier that people had to struggle with, and particularly that linked in with the dyslexia is that if you struggle with your learning, then you felt like, and you were told that you were stupid, then this fed into kind of people's poor mental health. So lack of understanding from teachers. So if they had, depending on where, overwhelmingly, my learners have grown up in quite poor areas, and so perhaps went to schools where at the time at which depending on their age went to school, and not an awful lot was known about dyslexia. And so, as you said, it was just like, you're not keeping up with the rest of the class, you're not trying hard enough, your handwriting's not, you need to work on this. It's all about these kind of the deficit thing, absolutely. And this is what was reinforced for them. So this kind of lack of understanding, bullying from teachers was something that people talked about. Violence from teachers was something that people talked about. And then the final one was to do with their practical circumstances. So whether that was their home environment, that perhaps their family didn't have the didn't know how to support them because they had their own difficulties. This is whether or not they could afford. So barriers to improving literacy could be that they needed to work, and they couldn't, as an adult, they maybe wanted to learn, but that that the practical responsibility of having to earn money in whatever way that meant had to take priority because they had children, etc. Like, I spoke to one guy who learned to read at the age of 46 in prison, and he said, when I got into prison, I could either take the education route or like the work route, like where you kind of learn. And he said it was a no-brainer for me. Like, I just took education because I never went to school, because I was never given the opportunity. My grandma didn't send me to school. I grew up in Jamaica. She just kept me at home. She didn't know to send me to school. And, you know, I can't read. And he had fantastic experience of getting a dyslexia diagnosis and then having interventions and learnt to read. So that's around like the barriers. One of I think the key things that I try and talk about in my research is around what came out of that, which is the sort of approaches that support literacy in adulthood. So you've got things like having an informed diagnosis can be a real positive. Holistic and supportive teaching. So the importance of positive relationships with teachers was massive. So people saying, you know, when I came here, you were so, you know, it wasn't just myself. Like, I wasn't just myself that they were talking about. I interviewed learners. Some of them were mine, some of them weren't. But you know, overwhelmingly, they said people just made me feel at ease. You know, I didn't feel stupid for coming here. I just felt like they genuinely took an interest in me, and that was really important to people. Inclusive and multisensory teaching. So we know that from a dyslexic perspective, you know, the use of multisensory is, you know, there's really strong evidence that this is, you know, great, and it's done within schools. But, you know, offering teaching in a multisensory way, you know, rather than, it used to be that kind of identify somebody as a visual learner, or people might come to you and say, oh, I'm a visual learner, I'm a kinesthetic learner, but actually we know that, you know, if you can deliver learning in these multi-sensory ways, that's going to be the best way, because actually it's, you know, we don't always have an entire understanding of the way that we do learn. And so, you know, what you do need is that emotional, often an emotional hook, like something that stands out. So, and that can be reinforced. So you can have the relationship with the teacher, the positive. So if somebody makes you laugh in class, if there's something that stands out within that class, that's what will help you to remember. So, which is where the multisensory can come in as well, because if you feel something, if you hear something, if you then there's an emotional reaction as well. That's what helps us to go, oh, I remember that, you know, it stands out to us. So and then the final one, we've got group and individual specialist provision. So this was, people really valued being able, the opportunity to have one-to-one support, but also being able to learn in groups. And talked a little bit earlier about, you know, the power of learning in groups in terms of being with peers who have had similar experiences to you, but also that within one-to-one provision, being able to kind of really target individual kind of learning difficulties and have it being really kind of centered around your own needs and your own motivations and your own goals can be really helpful as well. And ideally you'd have that alongside each other. You know, you'd have opportunity for one-to-one, and then you'd have group environments which can help build social skills and mental health. Can be, you know, that's what came out of it. And I think so I'm now doing my doctoral research on the use of psychologically informed environments for adult literacy learners with experience of homelessness or compound trauma. So compound trauma is these, as I said, multiple experiences of trauma. And really this came out of my MA research because it's this sort of recognition that psychologically informed environments prioritises relationships. And I think this was what I I suppose my motivation, I thought that I need to look more at this. I've got this kind of picture of what it's like within one provision. What does it, what does it look like at services across the UK? So what I'm hoping to do is look at different homelessness provisions, perhaps some other alternative learning provisions within sort of mental health and prison, like hospital provision services, and perhaps within prisons as well. I'm still kind of working this out. So it's this kind of multiple disadvantages and homelessness and adult literacy and what motivates people, really. So it's a very broad thing to do with my research.
And I think it will be so valuable for us going forward. It feels like you're creating a blueprint, a roadmap for how to do this successfully and how to put the humanity right at the centre of what we're doing, which I think is, without that, everything is going to fail. It's got to be based on having an interest in that human person, in their experiences, in developing that relationship. And that's such a strong message that's come through from our conversation, Kat. And I wish you every success, and that we start to see your research informing how we go about making provision for vulnerable adult learners in the future, and the near future too. Because at the moment, I don't think the model we've got works particularly well. And this has got to change. We've got to put people at the centre and build relationships and put that at the centre of everything, and Absolutely. It not necessarily be about having a quota of an academic qualification. We've got to lose this. We've got to lose this model because it doesn't support these learners. The other thing that you said that really resonated with me was about people's achieving something at a level that is quite low. So a level 2 qualification, a level 1 qualification. It is very easy if you've had advantage and you've had a fairly easy pathway through your academic life to dismiss the importance of incremental learning steps and think that this has no value, because as far as you're concerned, everything starts at a GCSE and moves on from there. And this is a mindset that we have and that is promulgated. I'm getting a bit political now, but it is the mindset, isn't it? And the problem with that is that until we genuinely recognise that an incremental step can be incredibly important and uplifting for somebody, and a genuine validation of the achievement of something important, we're not going to make progress.
Yeah.
That foundational level needs to be underpinned, appreciated and supported.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's what I need to say about that, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this was, again, something that came out in my research, was that people are, so many people were motivated to gain qualifications, but there was absolutely no way that if I put them into, if I just arbitrarily put everybody into a level 1, level 2, as opposed to doing, when actually I do an initial assessment and they are at entry 1, it's just completely ridiculous. And yet, I've worked with people. I worked with one guy who was sort of a pre-entry level, and it took over 2 years, and was a time when I was able to work with people for that long. But I worked with him for 2 years, and at the end of that, he gained an entry 1 qualification. But that was so massive for him. English wasn't his first language, and he really. He was a phenomenal musician. Actually used to play as a session musician for a famous band back in the sort of 50s, 60s. But it took 2 years, but that was so huge for him to be able to do that. And I just think it's, as I said, it's so incredibly insulting to think that there's no value, or to take that away from people. And I know we do like kind of RAPA qualifications and stuff, but actually, no, like, why should people not have the, to be able to say, no, actually, I do have a certificate, and, I do have I've got an entry 3 qualification. And also because people's profiles of literacy profiles are spiky, so we some people might not be able to their writing levels might be lower than their reading levels, so they might be level 1 in reading, but then still be kind of entry 2, entry 3 in writing, and it can it takes a while to build that up. And so, but I can't tell you how motivating it is for somebody to pass a level 1 in reading, and yet even if they haven't been able to do that in writing, it's still it's a motivator. You need those little things which help you to move forward, and it's that success. It's like, this is how we, from a neuroscience perspective, so there's a couple of things from a neuroscience perspective that I love. Firstly, that we need to feel safe in order to learn. So this is there's I was looking at some quotes earlier on from sorry, bear with me for a minute. There's a guy called Bruce Perry who talks about he's got a paper called Fear and Learning and Trauma-Related Factors in the Adult Education Process. So he talks about how trauma changes the brain, and that learners bring this to the classroom, and that basically fear destroys our capacity to learn, and that often people kind of have this kind of constant low level fear, and that basically we have to create new positive learning experiences in order to kind of help us to our brain to override those negative early learning experiences, and that basically optimum learning relies on some curiosity, exploration, discovery, practice, and mastery, and this leads to pleasure, satisfaction, and confidence. And I just think that's really powerful in terms of thinking about the process of how, if somebody has experienced trauma, that that it's recognizing that this is the impact that it has, but then thinking about creating these new positive experiences, and how that can basically literally change our brain and change the way that we see ourselves as learners. But learning has to have meaning to the individual, and we need an emotional reason to learn. So, we need that emotional hook that's going to keep us coming back, keep us pursuing. And that's where, the success things can come into that as well. These little motivating things, having a positive experience. So, yeah.
Kat, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your research and for sharing your thoughts with us today with this talk. Really appreciate it. It's really, really fascinating, and I think a lot that we can learn from and do better.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this webinar. We hope you enjoyed this content, and if you'd like to learn more about neurodiversity and supporting individuals who have dyslexia, please feel free to click this link to your right and enjoy more awesome content. We'll see you there.